And now here's Little V Mills playing the iconic theme from Devil May Cry 2.
Wait, what iconic song from Devil May Cry 2?
The song, the Devil May Cry 2 song.
Dude, does Devil May Cry 2 even have songs?
Yeah, there is the Infested Chopper, I think.
Listen, let me know when you know what the hell you're doing, man. I'm out of here.
Hey, no, you come back here, we're not done yet! And let that be our tone setter. Now, it has been, 6 days since we last talked about a Capcom game here on What Happened, but thanks to Big Boss Trey Adams at the Flophouse VIP Patreon, this week we are table hopping into the story of how Capcom almost killed one of its most influential franchises that originally spawned at one of their other most influential franchises. This is how Devil May Cry 2 nearly sealed the fate, yet at the same time went on to reignite the sword-slashing series with
sexy style!
DMC, as some may know, originally started as an attempt to craft a new Resident Evil title, RE4 in fact. But with the radical changes that Windex enthusiast and man who still has me blocked, Hideki Kamiya instituted, it was decided to spin the game off into its own thing. Capcom was, and still is, all about producing sequels for just about everything except for Spyborgs, and it was much the same here when it came to their newest star, the Demon Hunter Dante. See, they were very confident in DMC's chances at retail for a few reasons, with said reasons being, it was directed by the person who helmed RE2. It was an exclusive for Sony's follow-up console, which was pretty popular, and lastly, they knew that
Dark Soul with light
would go on to be a cultural milestone moment that would define a generation.
Should have been the one to fill your dark soul with light!
So, a team was put together to start working on a sequel, but unlike most video game publishers or businesses in general, this was done before Dante had yet to bust out a single stinger. Yes, a follow-up was greenlit before the original had even been released, which was incredibly ballsy of Capcom, but given the eventual success of Dante's first adventure, they were right to do so. Because there wasn't any real reaction to the first game yet, no feedback to draw upon, the team were given pretty much carte blanche to do whatever, which is one of the main problems that plagued Devil May Cry 2. Lack of any real direction and a team that was incredibly inexperienced. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, in Devil May Cry 3142 graphic arts, various staff that had worked on the series since its inception shone some light on the dark soul of the project. One of these staff members was legendary Capcom artist Ikeno, who detailed just why the team that was put together maybe wasn't the best choice. Capcom had traditionally been split into two main pillars, the arcade division and the console division, but with the PS2's increased processing power and a change in the nature of Capcom's arcade game market meant a company-wide shift of human resources from arcade to console. With the company's big hits at the time like Resident Evil and DMC, many of the arcade fighting game teams were switched over to teams making games for the home consoles. These former arcade division employees were put in charge of the DMC sequel. This was a problem because with all their design experience coming from arcades, quick quarter-munching experiences that could be completed in 30 minutes or less, it left the team with little knowledge on how to craft a beefier level-based action game. For context, Capcom's late-era arcade titles were things like Power Stone and Spawn in the Demon's Hand. Projects that wouldn't have adequately prepared them for tackling the complexities of creating a sequel for a franchise that they had no hand in creating. What's worse is that pretty much every major staff member who contributed to DMC1 was absent on the sequel, with some not even being aware that DMC2 was a thing that was happening until months after the fact. Kamiya, Kobayashi, pretty much all the experienced hands within the console division never even touched this thing. In their stead, Capcom put fresh new hire Tsuyoshi Tanaka in a producing role, with directing duties being handled by, question mark? This is one of the still remaining mysteries which clouds Devil May Cry 2, as the original director, to this day, has never been publicly named. Some have speculated it was Shinji Mikami or the Windex Master himself, even though none of that makes any sense for literally all the reasons. What we do know is that the initial team makeup was composed of people who had worked on Capcom's arcade fighters, but beyond that, the original director remains an enigma, trapped in a riddle, trapped in a red coat. Now, earlier I mentioned this new team was given maybe a bit too much freedom in their approach to a sequel, and Ikeno gave some insight into their thought process at the time, which was many of them didn't even understand or like aspects of Devil May Cry. At first, the protagonist wasn't even going to be Dante, but rather some guy with a green jacket. Looking back at the game's fundamentals, like the visuals and the overall design, we didn't take the parts of DMC1 that players wound up loving into account, so the second game felt very artificial. I think our attitude was a little too much, we're gonna make it how we want to. Dante's sudden change into a more taciturn or reserved character was the producer's decision, because he didn't like the joke-cracking wise-ass Dante from the first game. The team agreed, and that was the direction we went in. Dante's sudden silence almost seemed to imply that something terrible had happened between the events of 1 and 2. Aside from just changes to characterization, the team struggled in another area: level design. Since the original DMC was built off the skeleton of a Resident Evil game, multi-tiered level structure, backtracking, and puzzle items were prominently featured. This new team, having zero experience designing in that style, simply made large, mostly barren stages that had little functionality or detail, leading to a very empty game world by comparison. Things meandered on like this for about a year, with the game and team never really coalescing, and with only 6 months left in the proposed deadline. This is when Capcom higher-ups took a good, hard look at the project and realized it was probably going to get an F ranking in the style department. Therefore, they stepped in to try and course correct. Now, I know what you're thinking, oh man, this must be the part where things got really fucked. And in a nice twist, no, it's not. It is in fact where DMC2 got unfucked, or less fucked I should say. With everyone else at Capcom kinda busy, or maybe when asked if they wanted to take over directing duties and replying with, oh, I'm fucking not. Hideaki Itsuno was then hired to reorganize the project, with the older mystery director being hoofed out in the process. Now it's true that Itsuno also came from an arcade background, having worked on both rival schools and Power Stone among many others, but at the end of the day still had a ton of experience leading on big projects. There was a lot of drama over my replacing of the old director, and I have nothing but bad memories about that part in particular, but basically they said that nothing was getting done and that needed to change. The scenario hadn't been written, the cutscenes had yet to be shot, and they hadn't decided what to do about Dante's Devil Trigger. They had determined that the Stinger attack was essential, so at least they had someone who was going to take care of that. But none of the other attacks had been worked on at all. Speaking of attacks and combat, it's another aspect of this sequel that the team felt needed to change, despite it being an integral part of the first game. See, when Capcom started receiving fan feedback and reaction from DMC1, some of it revolved around its difficulty, as there was really nothing exactly like it on the market. Dante's quest challenged you to stylishly kill enemies without ever getting touched, which was something not every player was accustomed to. So it was decided to lower the overall difficulty, and when I say lowered, I mean spam your guns! Seriously, 75% of the game can be trivialized by whipping out Ebony and Ivory and to never stop shoot banging. This distinction is what caused some to call DMC2 the best third-person shooter released in 2003, and unfortunately this was something Itsuno Itsuno either didn't or couldn't really change. The hardcore fans of DMC1 weren't exactly happy, but newcomers to the series liked it a lot. The people who especially liked it were the ones who had tried DMC1 but found it too difficult and quit partway through. I read a lot of survey responses along the lines of, DMC1 was awesome, but I just wasn't feeling it. I felt it in DMC2 though, so thanks! I need to meet these fans. Seriously, which part were you feeling there, bro? This? With half a year left, there were only so many things that could be addressed and finished, and considering the overall quality of DMC2, I'm not gonna lie, I would have loved to have played the original pre-Itsuno version just to prove to myself that I could. With that said, it's actually surprisingly not all bad, because under Itsuno, some novel features that started here went on to become DMC mainstays. This includes switching weapons mid-combat, evasive maneuvers like rolling, flipping, and wall running assigned to a button, and finally, the introduction of Bloody Palace mode, which is something that's now expected in all future DMCs. But as much as Itsuno's involvement helped, there were plenty of other lamentable decisions that still managed to slip through. A big back-of-the-box selling point was the addition of a second playable character, something so groundbreaking and bleeding edge that it would need its own dedicated disc to become a reality. Lucia was a crimson-haired counterpart to Dante, who he would sometimes suddenly bump into during the course of the game. Putting the Lucia disc into your PS2 would then allow you to play the game as Lucia, and that's it. Minor differences aside, both discs contain almost identical data, so it's been rumored that this was simply a marketing tactic to make players believe they were getting tons of bangs for their bucks. Now, while this being the case was never confirmed by a Capcom employee, I mean, yeah, it was. Strange that Final Fantasy X, a cutscene and dialogue-filled 40-plus hour RPG released 2 years earlier, was able to fit on a single PS2 disc, but DMC2's 5-hour Odyssey could not. Now, as for Lucia herself, while brimming with potential, wasn't handled all that well, as cutscenes and story were hastily put together leading up to the game's launch. This left her designer, Ikeno, lamenting the fact that they were not able to expand upon her character. Sadly, the characters in DMC2, Dante included, are fairly tight-lipped and never really take any drastic action. I feel like if we had included a scene that showed how the standoffish Lucia is actually kind at heart, she would have been a more appealing character. But that sweet side never emerged, only the prickly one was ever shown, and that kind of thing is hard to show comprehensively in any kind of performance. Now, with all that out of the way, let's just get right to it. Remember that time when DMC2 had Diesel brand clothing? Diesel brand clothing? Diesel branded clothing seems like something of an odd fit for a Capcom game. They didn't typically succumb to the allure of product placement in their titles, but in this case there was a surprisingly simple but still nevertheless stupid reason it's in there. It was because Tanaka-san, the producer, used to work for them. It was a collaboration that made good use of his last job. People on both sides talked at the time and felt that DMC2 and Diesel's visual styles would work well together and would be quite appealing to the casual audience. Seeing Dante and Lucia wearing Diesel fashion on screen was very cool. There's something neat about watching them run through the game's story while wearing those clothes. It reminds me of RE in a way. Again, I don't know who this appeals to. Who looks at a shelf full of games, money clutched in their hands, and goes, I refuse to buy a game unless it's got some bomb-ass Diesel jeans?
Oh yeah, I got this. What a pittance.
Anyway, despite, everything, Itsuno did the impossible. In a mere 6 months, DMC2 became unplayable to playable, albeit a very unexciting action game filled to burst with infested tanks, helicopters, tanks, and more hella tanks. And the reviews were, mixed to say the least, with many outlets citing it as the most disappointing game of 2003, with others, well, not going as far, still marked it as a fairly weak follow-up. Dante, even though gaining one of his sharpest designs, was criticized for his lack of styling and/or profiling, with many fans not appreciating his attitude adjustment.
Till next time, son of Sparta.
A dynamo of charisma. Complaints were also lobbied against the superfluous second disc, boring bosses, uninspired level design, and especially the brain-dead difficulty. But especially the overabundance of infested... whatever. Now, despite the negative reviews, DMC2 was still a financial success, really the only success that matters to most publishers, as it wound up posting similar numbers to DMC1. At the end of the day, it was really this thirst for Dante which saved the franchise from falling over the edge into obscurityville. Who else is down there? Who is in there? Haven't seen you in a while. So, in a nice twist to the story that's a rarity here on What Happened, DMC2's reception is what reinvigorated the series to begin with, as Itsuno was determined to right the wrongs when he first wielded Rebellion. Part of me was dissatisfied because I hadn't started with the project from day one. As far as I was concerned, that didn't amount to a proper level of involvement with DMC, so I asked the company if they would give me DMC 3 from the start, and they agreed. Without DMC 3, I would be known as Itsuno, the director of Devil May Cry 2, as far as the series is concerned. Many of the same arcade staff who cut their teeth on console development with Itsuno joined him on Dante's Awakening as well, and they all rallied around the idea of going back to his cockier roots, infusing the game with a youthful energy and providing deeper combat mechanics. Making this a prequel to the first game also then logically placed DMC2 at the end of the series timeline, chalking it up to, in the future Dante, he doesn't really talk. Hey, look over here! He's doing silly things with missiles and shit. So you can say that this unfortunate bumbling step in the franchise is what informed the rest of the series going forward, which only got progressively more eccentric every time. So in that way, DMC2 is surprisingly important. This does of course remind you all that DMC2 is available in stores on the Devil May Cry collection, as well as a standalone package for $24.99 on the Nintendo Switch for some reason. If you know of any other stylishly troubled video games, movies, or consoles, let me know in the comments below, rainstorm down into my Twitter, or take a motorcycle ride over to the Flophouse VIP Patreon, become a big boss, and nominate the subject of a future episode of What Happened. See you next time, kids, and thanks for watching.